Welcome to the Pioneer Podcast. This is Ernst Roets. By now, it's not controversial to say that the West is in a serious crisis and that we ought to take serious consideration as to what it means to be a Westerner, what the concept Western civilization means, whether it's something that's worth preserving, and if we decide that it is worth preserving, what ought to be done or what could be done, realistically speaking, to achieve this. Now, this is a topic that is very important to us and very dear to our hearts as Afrikaners in the southern tip of the African continent, because even though we regard Africa as inherently part of our identity, with our community having been shaped in Africa, our language, Afrikaans, named after the continent, and our community or nation, the Afrikaners, having been named after the continent. We are also Westerners in the sense that we sprout from Western civilization, and we regard the history of the West also as the history of our people. So in as far as there is a threat regarding the future of Western civilization, we here on the civilizational outpost in the southern tip of the African continent also take this very seriously. And this is something that we are going to discuss today. And so I'm very delighted to have Professor Koos Malan with me today. Professor Malan is a constitutional jurist, a person often quoted in the media in South Africa, having written several books, including Politocracy and There Is No Supreme Constitution, and someone that also, like myself, takes a keen interest in the history of the West, the nature of Western civilization, and what we ought to be doing. So, Professor Koos Malan, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Ernst. Thank you, Dr. Roets. It is great to be your guest. I'm delighted to be here, especially for the reason that we are addressing a topic which is certainly of the utmost interest to ourselves, to our community in a sense of the Afrikaner community, but also the broader community of Western civilization. It's very important to address it, so I'm delighted to be your guest and indeed to deal with this topic.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor. And now I should say, for transparency's sake, that Professor Malan is not new to our environment and our circles here. Professor Malan is involved with several of the institutions in the Solidarity movement. And I also had the privilege of doing my doctorate, my LLD under Prof, which I'm very happy to have completed a few years ago. But now the tables have turned, so now I'm the one asking the questions, and you have to answer the questions. So I'm happy to have you here.
I trust I won't fail.
Well, that will depend on your performance, but we'll see. Let's start with this recent event that a lot of people spoke about all over the world, which is the opening ceremony to the Olympic Games in Paris. And the way in which that transpired, and I don't think it's necessary to explain what happened, I think everybody knows. But what was very interesting about the opening ceremony and the woke approach that they deliberately took with this portrayal of the Last Supper. They initially denied that it was a portrayal of the Last Supper, and then some of the actors who were involved actually said, no, this is, the one lady declared herself to be the Olympic Jesus, the lady in the middle of this picture that they were creating. But the viewers would know about this. But what strikes me about this event is the significant backlash to what happened in Paris. And that is measurable in many ways. One is me personally, to a large extent, after having seen that, lost interest in watching the rest of the Olympic Games, at the expense of the athletes, of course. But also, you can see that in the type of reaction we had on social media. I remember the next day, the French Prime Minister made a very neutral tweet saying that it's great to be in Paris and the Olympic Games are fantastic. And there was something like 40,000 replies to his tweet, and there was not, I scrolled for several minutes and I could not see a single positive reply. Every single one of them, that I saw at least, was negative about the way in which Paris framed this opening ceremony. And what was also significant is how what you might call other civilizations responded. People in Africa, people in the East, in China, the Muslim world, who have said that maybe this is going too far. What's your view on this?
Yeah, Ernst, there's a lot to be said about this. In the first instance, it is quite telling that this is happening in Paris, which was also the major setting of the beginning of the French Revolution back in 1789 and afterwards. When one speaks about the French Revolution, normally what is in the center of the discussion, which is actually wrong, is just the coup that has taken place, that took place, and the eventual assassination, the eventual killing of the king and the queen and so on. Yeah. But that should not be standing in the center of the French Revolution. What also happened in the French Revolution is that they actually rejected the Christian calendar. Okay, and the revolutionaries established a new calendar. Now, this in itself is not so important, but what it symbolizes is of the utmost importance, and that is that it rejected it rejected completely and dealt with the utmost contempt the Christian religion, the Christian heritage, and proclaimed to be able to start something completely anew. So the French Revolution, in that particular very important sense, was a rejection of Western civilization. In that sense, it was an extremely leftist act. Now, what has happened now, more than 240 years afterwards, of 200 and let me not do the calculation, was something very similar, but actually more extreme. Because this did not only, these actions, the opening ceremony, did not only reject Western civilization, it rejected civilization as such. It dealt with complete contempt, the entire idea of civilization. Why am I making this assertion? The reason for that is, you might be dealing with Western civilization, Chinese civilization, Japanese civilization, Hindu civilization, Islam, and so on and so forth. You might be dealing with an emerging African civilization. But all civilizations, like all communities, smaller communities within civilizations, set particular standards. They distinguish between what is good and what is bad, what is ugly and what is beautiful. What is to be pursued and what is to be going against at. Everyone. So there are certain standards, certain norms. Civilization is not something ever to be associated with what is normless, without norms at all. It distinguishes, and let me also say it discriminates, because where after it has distinguished, it also passes judgment and say, well, we distinguish not only on a level as if everything is the same. We say, as I've said, one thing is good and the other thing is bad. So the moment you reject that, and the moment you proclaim that, well, anything goes, and more or less all things are morally and otherwise on an equal footing, from that moment on, you have jilted civilization. You have rejected civilization. And I think in that sense, the opening ceremony, with all the ideological baggage that it carried with it, is a rejection, once again, like the extremes of the French Revolution, of Western civilization, but at the same time, it is also a rejection of all civilization, all civilizations, because I think later on we'll speak about the difference between civilization in the singular sense and civilization in the plural sense. But I think the best explanation that one can come up with is that the reason why Muslims, Chinese people, and so on, why they also took offense of this is because this was a rejection of all civilizations, of civilizational form of living. I think that's the reason.
Yeah. So we often speak of the works of Samuel Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations, which is something that I would encourage our viewers to read if they haven't done so. But what you are saying now is that the nature of this civilizational fight that we are in is multifaceted, in the sense that the struggle for civilization a few hundred years ago, in some cases, was at least a form of civilized communities or scientifically developed communities clashing with more rural, what you might call primitive communities. Yeah. There was an element of that in Africa and in other places in the world. We then moved to a place where the world was largely characterized by this clash of civilizations. Yeah. Between Christianity and Islam and so forth, which is still there. It's still a reality. But what you're saying now is there's sort of a third dimension to this, which is that there's a clash between those who wish to preserve the concept of civilization and those who wish to destroy the concept of civilization. Is this an accurate explanation of what you are saying?
No, I think that really comes close to it. I also brought along the book Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order. Let me first, because your question actually started off with that, say something about the book.
Yes.
Without wandering from the point. The book was written back towards the end of the 1990s, at a stage towards the end of the Cold War. In that era, it was clear that the take on history, the interpretation of history, as if history has actually come to an end, as argued by
Francis Fukuyama.
By Francis Fukuyama, was in a sense wrong. As a matter of fact, with due respect to Professor Fukuyama, it was completely wrong.
But it was almost a universally accepted.
It was universally accepted for actually only for a short time.
Yes.
At this stage, Fukuyama, as far as that thesis is concerned, is really on the back foot, because that can no longer be defended. What was important from Huntington's point of view was actually to explain that the older divisions, but more importantly, before you come to the divisions, the older senses of identity that has been suppressed during the Cold War, that all those senses of identity were kind of pushed to the background for a while after the Second World War, and perhaps even before that. But that did not mean that they were completely extinguished. On the contrary, they were still there. And what happened after the Cold War is that those civilizational identities strongly came to the fore, especially Islamic civilization, but also Chinese civilization, Japanese civilization, and so on, presenting themselves in a variety of ways. So the fact that the Cold War came to an end, more specifically, the fact that the clash between ideologies came to an end, did not mean that history had come to an end. It meant the exact opposite, namely that the much more permanent, the much more durable identities, namely civilizational identities, strongly came to the fore after that period of 5, 6, 7 decades. And I think as far as that is concerned, Huntington was absolutely spot on. That is what we're actually witnessing. Our conversation here is not in the first instance about international politics, but let me just say one thing. At the moment, we witness China as a world power strongly coming to the fore. We are also witnessing India, which also, on the basis of identity and a form of what I would call constructive identity politics, has come to the fore in international politics. But that is not only a fact of realpolitik. It's not only a fact of international politics, because the backdrop of that, the foundation of that, is actually the variety of civilizations. Now, I think it's important to highlight that. But I had the privilege of meeting Professor Huntington when he was on visit in South Africa. I think it was in 1998. But I want to make a little correction to what Huntington has written. I don't think the relationship between civilizations should in the first instance be conceptualized as a clash, as a struggle, especially against the backdrop of the emergence, the strong emergence of far leftist ideology. Marxism, that has always been there, well, not always been there, but which has been there for the past almost 2 centuries, but also the new mutations of Marxism, of which wokeism is theoretically not strong, but politically it's definitely there. It's actually just a new manifestation of far leftist Marxism. And that is an assault not only against Western civilization, but it is an assault against civilization as such, all civilizations, not only the West, but also, well, the West is very strongly targeted at the moment because this non-movement, in a sense, has arisen in the West, in the United States, and to a lesser extent, well, in the English-speaking world. To that extent, not that we are English-speaking, but that's also very important in South Africa because we experience wokeism at our universities, at our educational institutions broadly. But the fact of the matter is that we're dealing with an anti-civilizations trend in politics and in culture, which is precisely the embodiment of wokeism. And precisely for that reason, I think the most important thing to actually realize for people belonging to all civilizations, some of which we have already mentioned, is to inculcate the truth that what we are actually confronted with is an extremely inimical and extremely pernicious movement in this far leftist thing, first in the form of Marxism and now in this form of I'll call it new Marxism, a form of new Marxism, that we're confronted with now. As a result of which, we're not in the first instance confronted with a clash of the various civilizations, but Western civilization is confronted with a clash within its own ranks, intra-civilization. It's most serious in the West, but I think all civilizations are actually confronted with by this phenomenon.
So what seems to be happening is that people in China and India and Africa and the Middle East are looking at wokeness and these woke postmodern leftist ideologies, and to an extent they also regard this as a threat, because they recognize that it's not just an assault on Western civilization, but on the basis of civilization, the very nature of civilization. It's an anti-civilization. But yet, it's very clear that there's a very obvious double standard that is being applied by these activists, in the sense that they are deliberately targeting Western civilization and deliberately targeting Christianity. And I don't think anyone who is observing what is happening can truly believe that once they succeed in destroying Western civilization and Christianity and everything that goes with that, that they would stop there. It's pretty clear that they will then move on, even though they are very cautious now to criticize Islam, for example, or Africa or African culture or China and so forth, at least on a civilizational level. If hypothetically they were to succeed to destroy Western civilization, they would then move on to these others. But my question then is, why is it especially Western civilization that is being targeted and not the Middle East, not Islam, and so forth?
Yeah. Ernst, we can consider that, and it might call for a fairly thorough and long discussion. The first thing, and that might be controversial to say so, is that Western civilization, up to now, in the record of history, has proven to be the most successful civilization. At the most successful in the sense that the achievements of Western civilization are actually very difficult to surpass. There's no other civilization that can claim that it has surpassed the achievements of the West in many respects, as far as technological advancement is concerned, as far as political theory is concerned, as far as philosophy is concerned, as far as economic systems are concerned, and we can proceed. And also as far as what one might refer to as a very broad concept of élan vital. That is the extreme amount of energy that Western civilization has succeeded to muster, more or less, especially since the 1500s, which enabled it to expand all through the world, also to expand the West and to impose Western power on all civilizations, on all territories in the world, in Asia, in Africa, in South America, well, all the Americas, and so on. So, in that sense, all other people, other than Westerners, actually experienced, and sometimes very negatively experienced, the extreme energy, the energy gusts, the energy surges of Western civilization in the field of politics, in the field of colonization, in the form of colonization, in the form of slavery, in the form of imperialism generally. Okay, so what has happened is that if there's one civilization that has proven its inequality compared to all other people, it's Western civilization. In the process, if one wants to use these metaphors, Western civilization has certainly made itself guilty of sin, the most extreme forms of sin. But what is happening is this, and I'm just going to tell you just now why I'm emphasizing this. Whenever a person or a community is strong, whenever it proves to be potent, whenever it succeeds in a variety of achievements as a result of its tremendous energy, the energy goes in two ways, in a positive way and in a negative way. So you will have some extreme positive, by definition, achievements, and at the same time, because of the energy, there will also be, perhaps to the same proportion, the opposite of that, wrong things that you're actually doing, sin that you're actually engaged in, which to a certain extent, if one wants to compare or to put on the same level individual morality and communal morality, which was then sin. And things like slavery certainly fell within the ambit of what might be entitled sin. Okay? But I want to come back to the point. It's precisely because of inequality the West demonstrated its superiority. And one of the things that is really, well, the central thing going against leftist thinking, leftist convictions, is inequality. Okay? Because in terms of leftist thinking, wokeism, equality really stands in the absolute center of what wokeism stands for. All things that could lead to inequality, which on its part might lead to achievement, should be pushed aside in order to achieve equality, in order to achieve a normless, standardless condition. And I think that is precisely why this wokeism is directing itself towards the West, precisely because it's the prime example of making itself guilty of going against the idea in word and in deed of equality. I think that is in principle the main reason for that.
Could we then metaphorically say that the West has done some very good things over the century, like a young child eating healthy, exercising a lot, eventually becoming the strongest kid on the block? And once the West, or this boy having grown to a certain size and having developed certain muscles, have realized its own strength, it started bullying the other kids in the playground, and perhaps to an extent even climbing over walls into other playgrounds and telling the other kids how they should conduct themselves, as a result of which there was some form of an agreement that this kid has to be stopped. And so there's almost an alliance that's forming against the West. Would you see that as an accurate description?
I think one can go a long way with that metaphor, except for one thing. Within the West, you have this kind of anti-identity within the West, yes, namely leftist thinking. That is precisely, to my mind, why leftism, if one can call it that way, in the form of the thinking of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in the form of Marxism, and all its ramifications, including the latest one. That is why this has arisen in the West.
It's a Western thing.
It's a Western thing. It's a Western thing. Strangely enough, it's a Western thing when it wants to annihilate the West. But as you've correctly pointed out, also annihilate all other civilizations, which in themselves are also embodiments of the idea of inequality and achievement in its own right.
And so these leftist ideologies, even though they developed within the West, even though it's Western ideologies, Marxism and so forth, we also see a lot of people outside the West, people who are not Westerners and who reject Westernism, enthusiastically embracing these ideologies and becoming Marxists, hating white people but loving Karl Marx and so forth, and using these, what you might describe as Western ideologies, as a weapon to wage war against the West.
Yeah, I think that's a correct summary of it, because you get a lot of animosity in Africa, which is not to say all Africans are anti-Western. Not at all. We, as Westerners, as Afrikaners living in South Africa, having contact with people who by and large would not claim that they are Westerners, we know that. We know they mostly are not actually anti-West. But you would get you do get a trend, which you especially find in universities in South Africa. I know such people myself, unfortunately I should add, who are really extremely anti-West and who embrace these ideologies that have emerged in the West, specifically in the United States, and which use that as a strategy in order to also, in its own way, carry out sorties, and actually more than that, carrying out a full-fledged attack also on the West. We as Westerners, cherishing Western achievements, bringing about and establishing typically Western institutions still in South Africa, we know that because we experience the animosity that is forthcoming from such circles. At the same time, however, I should add that most probably, and I by implication already said so, but most probably the vast majority of Chinese and Indians and so on and so forth, people belonging to their own, people having their own civilizations with tremendously long, with wonderful cultures, wonderful achievements, and very long histories, quite often longer than Western history, are not actually anti-Western. Okay? So in other words, the people that you would find in other civilizations who present themselves and who behave in an anti-Western way would in most cases also be people cherishing leftist thinking similar to that you find in the West.
Maybe this is a good moment to take a few steps back and to just talk about this question, but what is the West? And I know we've spoken about this in the past, but if we talk about the West, what is that? Is it white people? Is it Europe, people coming from Europe? How can we define, if that's possible, or if not, how can we describe Western tradition and Western civilization?
Ernst, That's a major question. And even though it's a major question, and even though you have said you want to take a step back, I even want to take one step further back. And that's just the following. It is very important to draw a distinction between civilization broadly, the general concept or the general notion of civilization, in contrast to specific civilizations that we've already referred to. Western civilization, Orthodox civilization, Eastern Europe, Russia, and so on. Chinese, Indian, Japanese, and so forth. That's the first very important distinction to make. You'll also find that into historiography. You find certain histories that is just a history of humankind. And then you find many histories which specifically take as their central actors of history the various civilizations. Oswald Spengler, Fernand Braudel, Samuel P. Huntington, Max Weber, and numerous others.
As opposed to people like Yuval Harari and Jared Diamond.
Exactly. Which is not to say that is an illegitimate course in historiography. It's legitimate to also tackle that, but which does not mean that there's not something like civilization, something like specific civilizations. Even you get certain historians actually claiming that. I brought along this book, which definitely not this one, but that one, and it's this one. The West, a New History of an Old Idea by, I don't know how one pronounces this name, but okay, McSweeney. And McSweeney says, well, actually, you guys are making a serious error. You speak about Western civilization, but there's never been something like Western civilization. It's just a modern claptrap. It's nothing more than that.
The Yuval Harari line is, it's a fiction.
It's a fiction.
We make up, it's something that we believe in our minds, but it doesn't really exist. Yeah. It's not tangible.
Exactly. Now, what they would say, for example, it's only recently, for example, in the United States, around about the First World War, that people start speaking about the West in contrast to other civilizations. Or perhaps since the days of, which is more or less the same period, the days of Max Weber also. Now, obviously, that is not to say that it's a fiction. What happens is, more often than not, you can only grasp a phenomenon if you look back. When you're in it, you not realize that you're in it, okay? And you can only reflect upon Western civilization in the same way that you can reflect upon anything else, that you are in a position of standing a little bit outside in terms of space or in terms of time, and look at it at a distance, okay? This is precisely the reason why it's only in this era, around about 120, 130, 140 years ago, that people started to write about the West. Because at that stage, we were actually at a vantage point that allowed you to look back, that allowed you to look at the various civilizations and to compare. So this is not to say it's a fiction. It's the opposite. You're in a better scientific position, actually, to make proper observations. That's the reason. So this is, to use quite harsh words, it's nonsense to say that it's a fiction. It's a very hostile thing, actually, to say, because that is to say that your very identity, the most important aspect of your identity, is questioned and denied and condemned. That's actually what it says.
And the existence thereof is rejected.
Exactly. Now, the next point I want to make about in answering your question is this. One is, and we as Afrikaners, belonging to a minority community, a minority cultural community, we're keenly aware of our own cultural identity, precisely because we are a minority living in the same space as many other people. We know the other people, we go about with them actually very effectively and on a very friendly basis. We have a lot of experience in that in South Africa that we can actually do that. But so that's your most basic cultural identity. But that is only the beginning of your cultural identity. Because your cultural identity also expands a much broader horizons. And that is when you go to something like a civilization. Within a civilization, take for example, say Western civilization, and let's put some kind of date on the beginnings of Western civilization and say, well, it began round about the year 800, 900, 1000, a beginning period, a commencing period, okay? When did the Afrikaner volk, for our obviously English-speaking listeners, you don't have that word. It's a Germanic word. You have it in Afrikaans, you have it in Dutch, German, and so on. Also in the Scandinavian languages, but in English and in French you don't have it because the people were they were influenced by Latin. Okay, and Latin doesn't know that word.
You could say a people in a certain sense.
A people, yes. People, but it's quite forced. Yeah. Okay, but that's the closest that you can come. I would
think the word volk in Afrikaans and German and so forth has a slightly stronger emphasis on a cultural identity than the word people in a singular has. I mean, we can talk about that.
Most definitely so. Just to add something onto that for in passing, the German word, the way in which we speak about civilization, the German word would be Kultur, okay, culture, all right, which is the Kultur, the culture of a folk or the culture of a civilization. Now, just back to the point. Part of and a very important part of our cultural identity is our belonging to a folk, to a cultural community, to a people. But broader than that, you also belong to a civilization. Cultural communities, a folk, peoples, come into being within the broader ambit of a civilization. The Afrikaner community, Afrikaner folk, only came into existence by the 1850s, 1840s, 1860s. There's a big debate about that, very interesting for historians, okay, as part of one of the many peoples, cultural communities within broader Western civilization. That is how one should understand it. And what I'm referring here, amongst others, is to the work of Arnold Toynbee, who said the most general cultural identity is the cultural identity of a civilization, right? So our cultural civilization, being Afrikaners in South Africa, like the cultural identity of English and Scots and Germans and Portuguese and Italians, and so on and so forth, are all within broader Western civilization, covering a much longer period. Now, okay, that was now a long back. I think the most important thing when one speaks about the characteristics...
Can we just... You have said this now, but maybe if we can summarize then the difference between civilization in the singular and civilization in the plural. Based on what you've said, how can we then summarize this?
Okay, right. It's actually a very topical question. Yes. When one speaks about civilization, you can contrast it with something like primitivity, a primitive community. Now, a very specific thing about civilization in contrast to primitivism or primitivity is that it represents a settled community. There must be a form of, a high amount of settlement at a specific place. So it's not nomadic. It's not nomadic. There can be, even though we acknowledge that the history of mankind is also a history of migration, at the same time, a civilization is a phenomenon, a human phenomenon, where people are mainly settled at a place on a permanent basis, and where they have also created cities. It's in part urban. In contrast, and I think that is the important thing of a civilization, because once you are sedentary, once you are settled at a specific place, you are actually in a position where you can attend to things which are of real cultural value, such as the formation of capital, such as the need to look after what has been formed, such as arts, such as
also very practical things like a city square or a marketplace where people come together and they exchange ideas.
Exactly,
and so forth.
exactly. So that is not achievable when you are nomadic. It is perhaps to a very, very limited level achievable, but not really. So all those things that you have referred to, you know, the typical things that you would have found in, say, classical Athens, you know, the major capital formation, which allow people to live as a community and to produce on a permanent basis all kinds of art, be it clearly art in the singular sense of the word, or politics, culture in a broad way, philosophy, and so on. And together with that, let's not forget that is the extreme importance of writing. So it's being settled, capital formation, and being literate. In contrast to primitive societies which are precisely not that, not literate and not settled.
Okay, I just want to add something. It's implied when you say being settled, but also a sense of the importance of borders. Having certain borders, which of course can manifest in a variety of ways, which also links to this point of the attack on the principle of civilization is first and foremost an attack on the existence of borders, whether it's physical borders or moral borders and so forth. So there's a strong element of that.
Yeah, Ernst,
well.
I think that's very, very good that you've emphasized that, because that's absolutely crucial. Borders, yes, boundaries. You can set that. Now, okay, in contrast then to a variety of civilizations, there are many human communities who comply with these requirements that we've just mentioned. But those communities, being civilizations, then differ among each other. And that is where the variety of civilizations comes to the fore.
Yeah. So if we move then to Western civilization, and if I can preempt the question with just in addition to the question, is it's difficult to pinpoint certain things that could exclusively be linked to Western civilization. Because the ways in which we could describe Western civilization, we might also use to describe other civilizations. But how would you define, as I said, or if we cannot define it, describe Western civilization?
Yeah, I think that's a good description in contrast to definition. And I think it's also good that you've mentioned that. The mere fact that I've mentioned just 5 minutes ago that we were in agreement as far as that is concerned, that you're dealing with settlement, urbanization, capital formation, literacy, and borders, that is something which is characteristic of all civilizations. So there already you have a core commonality. That's very important. Okay. So when mentioning some things regarding some characteristics about Western civilization, I concede, well, it's not a concession because I'm not forced to do it, I immediately proclaim that to a lesser or larger extent, this is also characteristic of other civilizations. Well, firstly, we must speak a little bit of history. Not too long. If we really dig into the details of that, it will consume a tremendous amount of time. But Western civilization is a successor civilization, in the sense that there were previous civilizations on which the West drew in order to eventually become the West. And I think there are three important pillars of Western civilization, which form the backdrop for the succession to take place. Basically, three Mediterranean civilizations, and that is Christianity, that is the learnedness, the philosophy, the quest, and the passion for science, for finding the truth from a philosophical point of view that you had in classical Greece, especially Athens. And perhaps one should also, that is something that dawned upon me in the last couple of weeks, perhaps one should add Alexandria, not failing to acknowledge all the other centers, but those are the two most important, arguably, centers of that second yes. Pillar of Western civilization. The first, obviously, Jerusalem. And then thirdly, and I must say that I think some people would not assign such an important characteristic, such an important role to it. But as a jurist, I must say it, not only because I'm a jurist, but because I'm keenly convinced about that. Rome, which is the civilization characterized by order, by statecraft, not in the sense of a state that we today understand it, but how do you organize on a legal basis a large community, and the sense of law. Those are the three. Now, obviously, they influenced one another. We know that in the year 146 BC, Rome invaded Greece.
I just wanted to say they also rejected one another to an extent.
To an extent. Yeah. But eventually, Roman civilization was profoundly influenced by Greek civilization. Yes. And obviously, we know that both of them were eventually as profoundly and even more influenced by, call it, Christian civilization. But then there's a fourth one. And the fourth one actually already addresses something of the mutual influence that I've just referred to. And that is that the three came together in the beginnings of medieval times and actually form what one might call some kind of synthesis, okay, the three of them. And to that was added what I would call the élan vital of the West, which is a sense for freedom, and specifically as a tremendous energy, which eventually manifested in a variety of ways, be it in intellectual endeavor, from around about the year, say, 1000, even before that, but after the year 1000, when the universities were started to be formed in northern Italy, later on in northwestern Europe, and so on. So learnedness, science, art, theology, law, philosophy, but eventually also giving rise in a tremendous gust of energy after around about from 1450 roundabout, which eventually gave rise to the tremendous achievements of, call it, Western man and Western women in all spheres of life. Okay? I think that together, this last one perhaps calls for some more explanation. But what happened was that before the Renaissance and before this period of, let's draw a line, 1500, the West was to a very large extent still looking back, considering the biggest achievements to have taken place already in classical times. But during the Renaissance and afterwards, a new orientation came about, which was not an orientation of only looking back, but also looking forward. And that manifested in, amongst others, exploration, amongst others in colonization, first on a meager basis, later on very aggressively. And it gave rise to the performance and the achievements of Western man in all fields. Let me just mention one or two. You can't think of modern economy without the banking system, without something like the company, the phenomenon of the company, the phenomenon of insurance. All that has developed in northern Italy and the south of Germany and eventually in England, from where it spread all over Western Europe. Okay, let me stop there. So I think as far as the background is concerned, that classical background is crucial. The coming together, the blending, and the adding of the élan vital in the period, say, from 1100 onwards, I think that eventually encapsulates the West. As to the characteristics, one can go into much detail on that. Perhaps it's appropriate to do it.
There's so much that we can and should say about this, but we're also running out of time. But there's one or two more points that I want to touch on. So you mentioned this McSweeney, who spoke of the West not really being the West because it was only described as the West. It's a recent development to talk of it as such. And it reminds of that line by G.K. Chesterton where he says that all this talk about humanity and the fact that we are all just people still doesn't change the fact that he has more in common with Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, than with the Chinese person sitting across from him in a London tea shop. And by that, he's not saying that as a derogatory comment towards this Chinese person, but he explains it. He says that he thinks he knows to an extent what the ancient Greek thinkers and leaders felt like, and the Christian thinkers, what Isaiah and David and so forth, how they thought in a way that he can never truly comprehend how ancient Chinese thinkers and leaders felt. And so this, even though there's this philosophical argument that no, this is just a fiction, that doesn't change the fact that people think in a particular way. And perhaps there's another slightly forced metaphor that we can use on this, is to think of the West as a plant. And you mentioned what you can call the roots, being Athens, Rome, and Jerusalem. And that wasn't yet the West. It was, in a sense, what you might call proto-Western civilization. And these roots eventually became a stem during there was this fusion during the Middle Ages, especially when they came together. And as a result of the roots becoming a stem, eventually we had branches and leaves and flowers and so forth in terms of the sciences and the arts and everything, the music and everything that sprouted from that. And now taking a step back and looking at the plant, we can say this is a plant. Yeah. But we couldn't say that initially when it was just roots.
No, because you won't know.
You wouldn't know.
But I think it's a beautiful metaphor. I think it's very workable, and I think it's very useful. Yes, you can use it. I think so.
So then to round off the conversation, we need to get back to this issue of the West, in a sense, eating itself. Now, Ernst van Zyl, whom you also know very well, my friend and colleague, also uses the metaphor of a fish in the water. If you're a fish and you're swimming in the water, you don't know that you are in the water until you are taken out. And that's his explanation of tradition. You don't know that you are shaped by tradition until you are pulled out of it. And now what's happening with the West, it seems that the water is becoming contaminated. And now what we see happening is Westerners rejecting the West. So people can see there's a contamination in the waters, and now instead of trying to clean the water, they are rejecting the water in essence by saying we need to get out of the water. And so we have this strange phenomenon now of so-called Westerners or so-called conservatives who now declare themselves to be Islamists or who declare themselves to resonate more with China, for example, or to say that they're on the side of Palestine or things like this, simply because they are in a reaction to what's happening in the West. And so my question is this an appropriate reaction? And assuming that it isn't, what would be the appropriate reaction if we recognize that the water is becoming contaminated?
Yeah, Ernst, no, self-annihilation can certainly not be an appropriate reaction. Because that is also what such people would do, not only to their civilization, but also to themselves. Because your very cultural identity and your individual identity is constituted by your belonging to, and I want to emphasize that, it's not a question of choice. You are in a civilization. I was born in the Afrikaner volk, in the Afrikaner people. I belong to it. Now you can certainly try to move out of it, but it's impossible. It's impossible because that's part of your personal history. That's
Declaring yourself to be Japanese doesn't make you Japanese.
It's impossible. You try to achieve the impossible. By the way, I said a while ago that one of the things that is characteristic of wokeism is this absolutely insistence on equality, as if it's almost an ontological fact that you can never deny. Another one is that unbridled individual freedom. You can decide whatever you want. It's impossible.
You can even decide what reality is.
You can even decide what reality is. Exactly. Now, this is impossible. One of the specific things about civilization, we spoke about that a while ago. Civilization in general are what I've said, the norms, the standards, and so on. Certain things are just given. Certain things are just fixed. How must you go about with it? Well, you have to accept it. You don't have any option. You cannot proclaim to yourself to be some kind of God, capable of achieving things that arguably can only be achieved by God and not by human beings. And this is the same here. If you want to change your identity as if you were not born and grown up in a particular cultural setting, cultural identity, if you want to achieve that, you want to achieve the impossible, you will be unsuccessful. So that's the reason.
Can I just say this, in the Afrikaans spreekwoord by C.J. Langenhoven is, skeer jouself los van jou eie mense en verwonder jou waarom ander jou nie inneem nie.
Yeah.
So it's something like, if you tear yourself loose from your own people, you will stand in awe as to why others aren't rushing to accept you.
Yeah, beautiful. The appropriate answer to the crisis in which the West finds itself is the following. I think we have an answer. The first thing is to realize that we have something which is of the extreme importance, something that is extremely cherishable, the most cherishable in cultural life, namely that we do belong to Western civilization. And as far as that is concerned, there's a very interesting phenomenon. 25 years ago, Afrikaners living in South Africa and possibly Americans living in the United States were, I would argue, by far not as conscious of the fact that they actually were Westerners. They might think of themselves as Afrikaners or South African or Americans, which is all fine. But they didn't actually realize that they also belong to the West. And what has been happening in the past 2-3 decades is a complete change as far as conscious of Westerners are concerned. We now realize that we are Westerners. And once you realize that you are a Westerner and you belong to Western civilization and you owe so much to it, once you are in that position, you are actually capable, you become capable of addressing the challenges that confront you. So we've come a long way, actually. So what should be happening is this. Westerners becoming more and more conscious of the fact that they are Westerners must also become more and more conscious of the fact that in order to sustain and to grow Western culture, because it's not only a question of defense, it's also a question of growth. That is very specific of Western civilization. Western civilization has always been extremely dynamic, growing, more achievements. That's the whole idea of the lust for life almost, elan vital. There are a huge number, so many you can't count them, institutions that actually set the infrastructure, that constitute the infrastructure for civilization, for Western civilization specifically. And possibly the most important are educational institutions. schools, universities, technical colleges, and so on and so forth. And what has been happening is that in the West, in South Africa, and in the United States, I think to a large extent, even though I'm not that au fait with the position there, has to a large extent lost their universities. So whereas our universities have always been the institutions from which Western culture was further fostered and developed, they are doing precisely the opposite. They are now a kind of an antibody. Well,
so universities have gone from the core of the solution to the core of the problem.
It's precisely like that. Now, the reason why it is so important to highlight that is, if you go back into history, then you see that one of the founding stones of Western civilization from, as I've said, around about the year 800, 900,000, specifically the 11th and 12th century, was the establishment of universities. That has actually called Western civilization consciously into existence and cultivated Western culture over the whole of Western Europe, eventually in all the various outposts, you refer to them, at the beginning of the conversations, including South Africa, where we, Afrikaners, for example, went to Europe. We loved the Germans, the German universities and the Dutch universities, because linguistically they were close to us. And what did we do? Well, we modeled ourselves on the Western universities. Our lawyers, our aspirant lawyers, aspirant jurists went to Leiden University. Here and there, someone even went to universities in the in northern Italy. And then also to Heidelberg and a variety of others, and also eventually to Oxford, Cambridge, and here and there to an American university. So the universities are really standing in the core of Western civilization. So a very important thing actually that our focus should be on is to rescue education and to reclaim education for the West. Going back then in history to what we've referred to 15, 20 minutes ago, to the very core of Western civilization as far as the history is concerned. We didn't have the time today even to really tackle the key characteristics, which I think is a very important topic, and perhaps at a later stage we can speak about that. But I think that is really where we have to begin. It is obvious that in the United States, and also, and I'm very delighted to say so, and at the same time grateful to say so, we Afrikaners in South Africa have done the same on a small scale, but Afrikaners have created a private university, okay, which is precisely anchored in all the notions of Western civilization. And together with that, let me draw the line there. I think having realized or realizing increasingly that we do in fact belong to the same civilization, even though we might be in the far outpost in South Africa, but where Western civilization is certainly alive, and I can even say well. But realizing that we belong to Western civilization together with our American civilizational compatriots, and Brits and Dutch and Hungarians and so on and so forth, Germans, Spanish, Italians. This is a common enterprise. This is a common endeavor. This is not something that should only be limited in all cases, regardless of where we might be, to a specific smaller cultural community. This is an endeavor for Western civilization generally. We have to cooperate keenly on this.
Well, Professor Koos Malan, thank you. I think maybe we can close on that high point, but also somewhat of a cliffhanger, because there's so much more that has to be said on this topic. And I think maybe to go back to that metaphor of the fish in the water, it is true that there's some form of contamination happening. And it is perfectly understandable and reasonable to react to this, to be angry about this contamination. As we've discussed now, the wrong reaction is to try to reject the water. But we need to differentiate between the water and the contamination. In other words, the good and the beauty and the truth in our civilization that we need to preserve, as opposed to these new strange ideas that is trying to attack this. And the irony is that if we reject the water as a result of the contamination, ironically, we are siding with the very thing that we are reacting against. So we are siding with those who are trying to destroy Western civilization by rejecting it ourselves before they can even do so. And the way forward would be many things, and we can talk about that, but based on what you've said, amongst others, a recognition of cultural identity, of traditional identity or civilizational identity, a recognition of communal identity, and returning to the very things that made the West great, or what it is, yes, such as our universities, our traditions, our religion, and so forth. So, Professor Koos Malan, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ernst. It was wonderful to have you as an interlocutor for this extremely important, perhaps the most important cultural topic that one can think of.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Ernst Roets. If you support this podcast and the work that we are involved with as the Afrikaner Foundation and the broader solidarity movement in South Africa, I want to encourage you to become a more active supporter. You can do this first and foremost by subscribing to our various social media channels, by leaving a comment and sharing what you have seen. But other than that, also by making a small monthly contribution to the work that we are doing through the Afrikaner Foundation's website, or by making a once-off donation. Links in the description.